Hi everyone, my name is Brian Lutchmiah. I'm the Inclusive Education Manager for Diversity and Ability based in the UK. I'm really excited to be joining the AHEAD US conference in mid-July, from July the 18th to July the 22nd at the Huntington Convention Centre of Cleveland in Ohio. Now, as part of our visit, myself and my colleagues, Piers Wilkinson, will be delivering a session on the UK to the USA, achieving meaningful inclusivity in practice, and we'll be exploring two or three themes around the student experience, the teaching and learning experience and delivery of professional services, and also leadership elements around the cultural impact in across higher education. Before we kind of go into the podcast itself, I'll just give you a short bio on the two speakers that were very kind to take the time out to join us for the recording. The first is Dr. Amanda Kraus, and Amanda currently serves as the Assistant Vice President for Campus Life and Executive Director of the University of Arizona's Disability Resource Center. She's also the President of the Association of Higher Education and Disability, or AHEAD, in the United States, having previously chaired its Standing Committee for Diversity. Amanda is highly involved in collaborative efforts with university personnel to foster the development of a seamlessly accessible campus environment and infuse disability into the campus community. Our second guest is Jennifer Pusateri, and Jennifer has joined us and is the Universal Design Consultant for the University of Kentucky Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching, or CELT, where she fosters the advancement of accessibility and inclusive teaching practices across campus. Jennifer has also served as a former co-chair for the International UDLHE, or UDL in Higher Education Network. In the spring of 2021, she also released her own 11-episode podcast called UDL in a Nutshell, which devotes each episode to each of the 9 unique UDL guidelines. I'd encourage all to check that one out. Welcome everyone, thank you for joining us. This is the first of a two-part podcast series hosted by Diversity and Ability. We're based in the UK, and my name is Brian Lutchmiah. I'm the Inclusive Education Manager for Diversity and Ability, and I'm delighted to be saying that myself and my colleague Piers Wilkinson will be joining our colleagues in the United States at the AHEAD US conference in July. As part of our preparation for the conference itself, we wanted to kind of deliver on a discussion to precede the session that we're hosting. And in doing so, I am delighted to introduce Amanda Kraus, who's the president of AHEAD, and Jennifer Pusateri, who is joining us from the University of Kentucky. Welcome. The question that we have for this particular conversation is, what are the current challenges faced in embracing inclusivity in service and curriculum design and practice?
Well, I can start from kind of my perspective
Thanks,
at the University of Kentucky. So I work primarily with faculty. A lot of the work I do is in the faculty development realm, but really focused in on accessibility and inclusive teaching practices. And so one of the things that we see a lot, especially as a result of COVID, I think this is kind of brought to light this idea of the hidden curriculum. So these are all of the things that we're expected to know and do, and that students are expected to know and do, that's not ever really actually said. And so that comes out in the form of a lot of different things. But one of those is really unclear expectations from instructors. And so when you're a student with a disability and you're trying to navigate this system that frankly wasn't designed for you, and you're trying to figure out how you're supposed to get through your coursework and be able to do this in a way that's really useful for you and for your student, or as a student rather, it's very difficult when you don't know what the rules are. And so that to me, that's one of the biggest pieces that kind of bleeds or seeps into everything that is part of higher ed in the US. I don't know, Amanda, maybe you have a different perspective from where you are.
Yeah, Jennifer, I would agree. I think the hidden curriculum is an important concept to really look at as we promote inclusive education, because, we come from a very even today, a very traditional model of education and higher education. And it's important to look at what we're not teaching students yet we're expecting them to perform on. I would say in terms of, resistance to inclusive education, I think there's a range of potential challenges. And, at the University of Arizona and at AHEAD, we do work with faculty as well. And I think, there's a miseducation or a misunderstanding around what inclusive means, right? Even what accessible means. So I think that there's maybe the fear that making something more inclusive or even putting accommodations in place would compromise rigor. And at a university, it's extremely competitive, and that's not something faculty are interested in doing, right? I also think that there's that folks need to invest some time in understanding what are the essential components of this course and what are the many ways I can help students get there. That even if people are interested, we have, again, a range of faculty. Some are very pro universal design, very interested in inclusion, but we might not catch them at the right time. Their course is already designed, right? The syllabus is done, everything is posted. So it is about, I think, timing, building relationships, and also being kind of supportive in investing time and resources into rethinking how to maintain the rigor, right? How to really produce an excellent course, but really rethink the how. And I think the pandemic has given us all a lot of good opportunity, right, to rethink things. For the last couple of years, we've changed the way we teach, the way we work, where we teach, where we work, but underneath that is really challenging some of the assumptions that we've gone into teaching and learning and working with. So yeah, I think that there's lots of good momentum right now, to put more of a silver lining, positive slant on it. But there are still a lot of barriers and a lot of challenges to really bringing people along in doing inclusive education, curricular design consistently and doing it well.
I wanted to touch too on something that you said, Amanda, that reminded me of this battle I seem to fight on a daily basis of kind of separating out this idea of inclusion and inclusive teaching practices from what people would think of as the DEI, or the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. While those things are not separate things, for some reason, the term inclusive teaching practices, at least where I'm coming from, that means making sure that you're teaching in a culturally responsive manner. So when I hear that as a faculty, like when faculty members hear someone talking about inclusive teaching, that's kind of what they're thinking about, right? They're thinking about more culturally responsive type teaching. And while that is, of course, important, for some faculty, separating out the idea of inclusive teaching with respect to students with disabilities is not something they're thinking about for some reason.
Right.
And I'm not sure where that disconnect has come from. And I'll tell you, coming from the world of K-12, when we talk about inclusive teaching practices, we're talking about things like teaching in an accessible way, using universal design for learning. That's what we mean when we talk about inclusivity, but for some reason in higher ed, that's got a different connotation.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And it's interesting. Some of it might be, positionality, right? When I'm working with faculty, when my colleagues are working with faculty, it's either coming from the Disability Resource Center, right? Or it's, our work with a national organization that promotes disability in higher education. So, there's something there. I speculate a lot, as to why disability is so often left out of the DEI space. And I do think it has to do with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, I'm a disabled person. I use a wheelchair, which isn't necessarily apparent on this podcast. So, I grew up before the ADA. I value the ADA. It's a very important legal foundation. And right, we've been so narrowly trained, right, in how we interpret it, right? So it's like diversity and inclusion happens over here, but then there's the ADA for disability. And I think, to your point, and going even back to the hidden curriculum, this is all one big conversation about inclusion, maybe even equity, right? Maybe even justice, right? We can make those parallels to other communities, but I think because maybe people have a fear of the liability, I don't want to mess up, I don't want to get sued, so I need to be really good about my ADA compliance. Or, there's the stigma is so, still so prescient, right? Still so salient that there isn't an idea that disability would be something to celebrate, to build community around. So the only way we respond to it is services and accommodations. I think that's kind of, I don't even want to say the future of disability work, but I think that's what needs to happen now, is bridging that gap, because universal design is obviously not a disability thing. There's implications for lots of different people, disabled people included, right? But that message, I agree, isn't really out there or well understood. Even with the folks I know who do culturally responsive pedagogy and training, adding disability, they're like, oh yeah, we should do that. It's like they're open to it, but it's not where they're coming from.
That's a really interesting point. I think well, you made many interesting points there, both of you. I think the thing that I'd like to pick up on is around the agility of the sector. And I know you mentioned about the pandemic, and obviously I'm based in the UK, you guys are based in the US, but there's going to be some parity about actually the impact it had on our respective sectors. And I know from a UK perspective, one of the things that came up was particularly about the reliance on technologies and how technologies can assist UDL, but also there was an element around actually identified a gap in the digital poverty divide that hadn't up until that point been at the top end of we need to do something about this. But then as a result of the pandemic, because everybody was in the same position, there were lockdowns and restrictions all over the country, it forced a level of bringing this to the surface, this undercurrent. And we work in a sector where technology and the advancement of technologies is amazing. When you think about transcription services and re-speaking and lecture capture and all of those things that are really useful in terms of aiding the pedagogical journey. So I suppose my question kind of goes back to, I suppose, the agility. So with all the rise of that and responding to those external elements, what do you think, I suppose, from a US perspective, needs to change? What still needs to change? And I think we've touched upon it, because you're kind of saying, well, there are these things, and is it fear driven? And is the fear of the legislation actually holding people back rather than necessarily driving advancement forward?
Well, one of the things that you said just really made me think about this kind of ableist text-based focus of higher ed, and the idea that listening to a book being read aloud to you is somehow cheating. And I think that I think that that's an issue that's going to, I don't know when that's going to go away. But so for myself, I'll speak for myself. I am an adult with ADHD, and I'm in a PhD program. I'm so close, you all. I'm so close. But throughout that program, I have relied heavily on using sort of the text to speech version, accessible. What's the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh, assistive technology, for myself, because I've needed that, right? And so, and I've kind of had to push myself to think, no, this is not cheating. Like, does it feel like it? Yeah, a little bit up front, which is crazy. Like, I'm in the accessibility world. I should not feel that way. But initially I did, and I've kind of had to work my way through that and talk my way through that to get myself out of thinking about that. This is not cheating. This is what I need in order to be successful. Am I still learning the stuff? Absolutely. So it absolutely counts. And I think that that's something, and this to me, I've seen this actually in K-12 and in higher ed, this idea that students sometimes feel like that's cheating. It's cheating to listen to a book being read to me. And I think until we can kind of get outside of that and to recognize that's just, honestly, that's ableist thinking. And that's sort of the the place we're coming from in higher ed with this focus on text and the written word as being so important and held above all else, and how we get away from that.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Jennifer. And I'm so glad that you brought up ableism in higher ed, because that's where I was going to go as well. In response to Brian's question, what still needs to change? I mean, all of these underlying assumptions about what education is, what academia is, what success is. I mean, it's all shaped and informed by institutionalized oppression, including ableism, including capitalism, right? It's like, time is money, and higher ed is an interesting environment, right? It's extremely competitive, it is exclusive, and it's hard to get away from those dynamics. When the pandemic first began, back in March of 2020, I remember thinking, great, we know what to do, right? We've been doing universal design for years. We've been putting accommodations in place for years. And it obviously wasn't that simple. It was a very challenging process, I know, for everyone in higher ed around the country and around the world. But it was like, okay, now that everyone else needs accommodations, it's going to be best practice. It's going to be required. So there was it was kind of a tension for me, where it's like, at first I was resentful, like, we've been doing this, we've been putting disabled people through this very separate process, all of our interactive process and determining what's reasonable and blah, 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 blah. And now that non-disabled people need it, it's just happening. So there was that. And then it was like, okay, non-disabled people are going to see how beneficial these types of options can be. And they're not going to be viewed as individual accommodations anymore. They're going to be viewed as our response to the pandemic. There's a lot of reasons, disability related and otherwise, that, captions benefit people, right? That listening to the lecture is the preferred way and the most effective way to engage with the content. And I think initially it was very hard for lots of people to understand that. 2+ years in, I'm hoping that especially faculty are getting more used to that these are all viable options. But that does take a consistent commitment to unlearning, the ableist, in this case, our ableist approach to education. I have a sense, that in 2 to 5 years, we're going to be in a much different place than we are right now. I think we're all still kind of frenzied and panicked as we're still in a pandemic, we're figuring things out. And I think that there's this reaction, especially in Arizona, there's no pandemic, we're going to get back to normal, don't tell me what to do. But I feel like once people kind of calm down and aren't fighting so hard to resist the pandemic precautions, that then they might realize, like, oh yeah, I'm just going to turn on auto-generated captions forever in every class I teach and every meeting I have, because it's just good practice, not because they're telling me to. So I think that we need to all kind of settle down and really reflect on what we've learned and the many things I think that work better now.
What's really interesting is there's this significant parity in terms of what you're discussing and how that reflects over in the UK, because it's very, very similar. And that aspect of, we've gone through a pandemic where if you apply the social model of disability, where it's the environment that disables the individual, you could argue that the pandemic disabled society, our respective societies. But as you rightfully say, Amanda, even within that context, disabled people are therefore disabled even further as a result of that process. So this element of learning and unlearning, I think, is a really unique part of that. How do you deconstruct what we do, and do we continue as we do because it's been tried and tested for many, many years, if not hundreds of years, depending on your outlook, and it's worked before? Or do we begin that discussion in depth about actually how diverse and inclusive does education need to be, and how do we break that down to the point where you deconstruct a program to its bare components, you think about the competency standards, you think about what is needed from students to demonstrate their knowledge and the different creative ways of doing that. And I think that is happening. It's happening in small pockets rather than as I suppose, a sea change in the sector. And that's probably the way that I would sum up kind of where we're at. But I think you touched upon a great point, which is we could argue that the pandemic isn't quite over, but we're getting to grips with it. But there is this fallout. And as this fallout, as you say, settles, what will happen, what will remain, and what will be the status quo moving forward. So moving on to kind of the next bit, where do you think leadership responsibilities may sit within influencing change or tackling some of these challenges that we've discussed?
I mean, I think leadership, if I may, is very important. If we're talking about higher education, really we have taken direction from probably all of our respective provosts in the last 2 years about what to do now and how to support students. I think going back to kind of what you were saying about, this commitment to learning and unlearning, and the leadership need to demonstrate that reflection. I would say that humility, that commitment to flexibility, because that's what it's about. We've had to be more flexible in the last couple of years than we've ever had to be before. And I know that that's been hard. And I know that people are tired. And I know that it's been a challenge. But we are working in education, and so you would think that this would also be an interesting opportunity, right? To break things down and really look at historically where the barriers were and what have we learned from doing things differently and how has that impacted students. So, I mean, I think really encouraging that reflection, from the top down is going to be important. I mean, if you're really thinking about leadership in institutions of higher education, then the promotion and tenure process needs to reflect that type of commitment to inclusion. I've said this many times, there's lots of ways that, faculty do service and obviously publications, and depending on the type of institution you're at, there's different priorities, but I mean, where is universal design in those priorities? And I mean, that's if an institution really wants to model innovation in a best practice, that's where it needs to go. I mean, it needs to become systematized. I like to think about higher ed as a model. We should be modeling the best practices, and yet we're often so slow to change and resistant. Leadership can help with that.
I mean, what would that look like if part of your tenure promotion was based on you demonstrating how you have shown accessible and inclusive teaching practices in your syllabus and in your in the way that you're actually teaching the instruction in your classroom and in your assessment? Like, if you had to demonstrate that as part of your tenure process, that would change overnight. Like, it would change overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also thinking about this idea, and I don't know, Brian, you'll have to tell me if this is an idiom where you all are, but this idea of don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? I mean, there are some really good things we've learned from this pandemic, and there are some things that we want to keep. Like, there's some stuff we don't want to keep, right? And let's get rid of that. But there's some stuff that's worked really well. And there's some stuff that's worked really well for students with disabilities that maybe had opportunities throughout the pandemic that if we go back to normal, and you're not watching the video, I'm using quote fingers here, but like, the pre-COVID back to normal idea, well, that wasn't working for everybody. Let's be honest, that wasn't working for everybody. And so there are some things that we want to keep moving forward. And I think part of the leadership focus there really needs to be on, okay, let's think about it and let's look at that. And that kind of leads us into what we're going to talk about, I think, probably next is how do we hear from students? Like, how do we know what worked well for our students? And we can ask them those questions and they'll tell us.
And that's the best segue I have never planned, Jennifer, in terms of that will draw us nicely to a close on this part of the conversation, and we'll be focusing on the student voice as part of the next conversation that we'll be having. I think there's plenty for us to kind of digest and to think about, and I think with the conference just around the corner, it'll be a really exciting opportunity to meet with colleagues and have these discussions further, because real change can only happen when you get minds together to really crack it. And there's a quote we have within DNA that was, I'm probably not going to say it word for word because I'm a bit like that, I don't remember everything. However, the quote is that diversity is about counting people and inclusion is about making sure people count. Now, I think that's hugely influential and important in how we go about the work in and across higher education. And also the systemic element of higher education isn't the end of someone's life or education, it's actually the beginning, you know, when they're going out into industry. So this ripple effect of the environment that the environments that we're creating educationally and the systemic element of going out into industry, if we do that right, all students will be graduating and going into industry and sharing that philosophy and developing that philosophy within the workplace environment. So there's an element of culture, a deep-rooted cultural aspect that also needs to change with this. And as you kind of said, you know, at the very start of the conversation, Amanda, it's a very exciting time for that. Thank you for listening. Join us for part 2 of the podcast, where we will be focusing on, I think, one of the most important aspects of any part of education, which is the student voice.